There are two phoenixes that come to mind when you mention that mythical bird in Formula 1. The first is the short-lived US Grand Prix on the streets of the Arizona capital in the early 90s, and the other is a certain Romain Grosjean. But there was supposed to be another phoenix involved in Formula 1 between those two things, one that should have been in the sport around the turn of the new millennium, that should have risen from the ashes of the former Prost team, named for its owner, Alain Prost. In the early 2000s it wasn't looking good for Prost, mostly due to poor results but also in part due to the changing legislation regarding tobacco advertising. Prost title sponsor Gauloises had done a runner, as had a lot of the other sponsors associated with the team. And there were some other things going on as well, as then President Jacques Chirac had promised Alain help in getting an all-French look for his team, but those never materialised. Brands such as Bic, Alcatel, Peugeot and others had all done one, and left Prost scrambling for funds the team didn't really have. And it's not like the drivers they had were terrible either, because they had quick Nick Heidfeld, who had risen through the junior ranks and done quite well for himself on the way up, and they also had Jean Alesi, very experienced and also one of the few drivers in racing history to have the same guy as a teammate and later on a boss. But despite this, the Peugeot engine in the back of the Prost at that time was highly unreliable, and they didn't score a single point during the 2000 season. So going into 2001, Prost would have been looking at the bank balance and getting a bit hot under the collar, and Ferrari came to the rescue when it came to supplying engines. Ferrari would supply Prost some V10s, which were branded Acer in the same way the Ferrari engines in the Saubers would be branded Petronas in a sponsorship agreement. But Prost, like all good teams with no money, would just become a revolving door of drivers for the season. Alesi and Gaston Mazzacani started the season, but after just 4 races the Argentine was dropped and replaced by Luciano Berti. Alesi was proving to be consistent, managing to knock on the door of points and actually scored points at the Canadian Grand Prix, after which he celebrated like he'd just won the championship, doing some donuts and then lobbing his helmet into the crowd, but it was the same track where he'd scored his only F1 win. It was at the circuit named after Gilles Villeneuve, in a Ferrari bearing the number 27. Alesi would score again at Prost's home Grand Prix at Manicourt, and it went back to business as usual, 15th, 12th, 11th, but then scored a final point at the German Grand Prix, but it would be his last race for the team. Berti meanwhile smashed into the back of Schumacher's Ferrari at the start, but that wasn't even his biggest crash of the year. Alesi then switched places with Heinz-Harald Frentzen, with Alesi going to Jordan and Frentzen heading to Prost, but the German couldn't improve on what Alesi had already scored in the 3 races he'd bagged points. He'd retire in Hungary, finish 9th at Spa, retire again at Monza, and then finish 10th at Indy and 12th in Japan. Berti was often knocking on the door of the top 10, but would then have 3 successive retirements. The first at Silverstone, the second being the one we've already mentioned at Hockenheim, and a third in Hungary. But at Spa, there is a DNS next to his name. What happened was Berti was fighting with Eddie Irvine's Jaguar, and as Irvine tried to go around the outside of the Prost, he cut in and wiped out Berti's front wing, meaning that try as he might, that car was never going to turn in for Blanchiment. The car went straight on into a tyre wall that was about 4 rows thick, and it took the marshals and Irvine a significant amount of time to pull him out. He went to the hospital for checks and things like that, but was found to be just fine, but Czech driver Thomas Enya would replace the Brazilian for the rest of the season. But despite this, it meant that Prost finished 9th in the Constructors' Championship, and they would be entitled to some prize money. But the prize money wouldn't be enough to keep them afloat for an entire season, and the debts were racking up. And then, in the January of 2002, Prost went into liquidation. There were some offers to buy the team. One came from a Saudi prince and the other came from former Ligier driver Pedro Diniz, but Alain refused to sell the team. His pride wouldn't allow him to do so, and he'd rather see the thing get liquidated than be sold. And liquidated is what happened. So after the liquidation, there were some vultures circling around ready to pick up what was left. One of those was supposed to be Craig Pollock, who had just been sacked by BAR and was potentially looking for a new job, but that was just paddock rumours. It actually all got sold to a man who had his fingers in a lot of pies through his racing career, and that man is Tom Walkinshaw. People thought that Walkinshaw was mad for wanting to buy the team. His own team, Arrows, was in financial trouble as well, and he was also in the middle of a court case involving Jos Verstappen, because Verstappen was claiming breach of contract when Tom had hired Frentzen for Arrows instead of the Dutchman. But through some convincing of the courts, Walkinshaw was able to buy all of the intellectual property for Prost Grand Prix. he paid about $2.5 million for the lot. But it turned out that Walkinshaw had bought the assets on behalf of a company called Phoenix Finance, specifically a man called Charles Nickerson, a friend of Walkinshaw's, and through the purchase of the IP, if Phoenix could get Prost back on the grid for 2002, they'd get the $12 million prize money that Prost would have had for finishing 9th in the Constructors' Championship. So enter everyone's favourite angry Australian, Paul Stoddard, who owned the Minardi team. Stoddard didn't want Prost on the grid, and he had a good reason for it. If Prost didn't turn up for 2002, Minardi would get that $12 million instead, and that would be huge for the team as Minardi was struggling financially as well. Stoddard said, "To me, liquidation is and always has been the final chapter in a company's history. Therefore, it can't come back from the dead unless all the creditors are paid and unless all the employees are paid. This seems to me that they've all been fucked over. Why am I not surprised? Look at whose name is attached to it." But just like the Andrea Moda team back in 1992, Walkinshaw and Phoenix had only purchased the assets and the intellectual property. Basically, they'd bought the assets and the name. They hadn't bought the entry. If they wanted to get on the grid, that would be another $48 million. So Phoenix worked on getting 2 cars ready for the second round of the 2002 season in Malaysia, while Walkinshaw helped them in the background, helping out with things like gearboxes and engines and stuff like that, supplied from TWR's own engine division, which probably didn't do Arrow's misfortunes financially any good either, because that thing was an absolute sinkhole. That and the engines that Prostniks were going to be getting were just rebadged Hart engines from 1998 or so, woefully underpowered. But nobody was taking this new team seriously. Bernie Eccleston said, "The guy from Phoenix has bought nothing. All he has is some show cars. He can forget it. He's wasting his time." FIA President Max Mosley wasn't losing sleep over Prostniks either, basically going, "Entry form? I've not seen an entry form." So imagine the surprise on people's faces when a blue transporter rocked up in Malaysia with 2 cars and 2 drivers. Where and if there was the rest of the team remains a mystery, but Mazzacane and Tarso Marquez were there and ready to go, subject to the FIA allowing them to race. But since the nose cone assemblies had already failed the crash test prior to the Australian Grand Prix, things were looking pretty grim for this new team. The FIA laughed in their faces and then impounded the cars to show Phoenix that they were serious about them not racing. That and the fact that they hadn't paid the entry fee. This had already happened with Andrea Moda back in 1992. They weren't making that mistake again. Meanwhile, Walkinshaw's standing there and going, "Well, how the hell's this happening?" But Phoenix wasn't deterred and threatened legal action, a press release for which was handed out by the Arrow's press officer who had just switched her orange top for a blue one. Phoenix was adamant it had a new team, but the FIA said no. So to try and dodge their way around it, Phoenix just changed the name of the team. Ha ha ha, they won't see this coming. It is I, Leclerc. They changed the name to DART, DART, which later transpired to be a company that Tom Walkinshaw was using in the 80s to distribute Dunlop tyres. But time was running out. They had to tell the FIA they were going to be racing by the 25th of March 2002, but whatever move Phoenix made, the FIA just put them back into check again. The best one of these pro-gamer moves being the FIA telling Phoenix that they couldn't race because the French racing authorities had revoked the licence for Prost Grand Prix. So Phoenix went away and came back and told the FIA, "Right, we've got a new racing licence, this time we've got it from the MSA, which is the British Racing Authorities." And the FIA just went, "Okay then, that'll be $48 million please." The legal wrangling set Phoenix back a couple of million, and when the court case ended, so did the attempts at getting on the grid. But who knows what this was all about? Maybe Walkinshaw was trying to use this in a massive gamble to try and get Verstappen a guaranteed seat on the grid and try and avoid all of the legal wrangling that was going on in the background. Or maybe Walkinshaw and Phoenix were going to collaborate together to have Phoenix absorb Arrows and try and wipe off all of Walkinshaw's debts. But we will never know the truth because Walkinshaw died in 2010 and people are just going to be very quiet in general, aren't they? But it never worked out, and Arrows folded midway through the 2002 season, and Phoenix, as you've probably guessed, never made the grid. And with the demise of Arrows, with it went TWR, with the Australian arm of TWR also folding and the assets being picked up by Holden. The team was then sold to Mark Scaife and Margaret Kelly. And there's another story in there too. Apparently that deal financially ruined Mark Scaife, but I can't find much on it. I will have to keep digging. Funnily enough, that team is now Walkinshaw-Andretti United, which is a joint venture between Ryan Walkinshaw, who is Tom's son, Zach Brown of United Autosports, and also Michael Andretti. But anyway, a look at the failed attempt at getting the Prost Grand Prix team back on the grid as a Phoenix team in the literal sense and the name sense. If you learned something new here today, be sure to give the video a thumb up, and if you're not already, get subscribed and also get that bell on to never miss out on one of my future videos. Massive thanks as ever to the good folk of Patreon. I think I've fixed the graphic now, but if you would like to help support the channel at a more personal level, or just join in the social media stuff and Discord and things like that, everything you will need is down in the description box for you. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.